Today, using the latest scientific tools and re-examining the evidence, experts are piecing together a new story of the siege of Massada, one that could challenge a legend. Sunrise over the Dead Sea. Another blisteringly hot day dawns on the mountaintop of Massada. This is one of the most visited sites in Israel. It's become a symbol of Jewish defiance and heroism. Here, on this very spot, 2,000 years ago, hundreds of Jews took their lives rather than submit to the rule of imperial Rome.
Massada has taken its place in the annals of military history as one of the great examples of a doomed and heroic last stand. It's up there with Thermopylae, it's up there with Custer's last stand.
There is a very eerie feeling there. And there is a strange feeling of a presence. And you stand there and say, wow, I mean, something happened in this place.
We have tales of heroic freedom fighters fleeing a doomed and burning Jerusalem, occupying Massada, holding out there for years against all that the Romans can throw against them. And then at last, when it seems as though the Romans are about to break in, the freedom fighters kill themselves rather than live on as slaves.
The myth is a myth of heroism. It's a myth which ends with death, and it's a myth which states we prefer death over bondage.
The core elements of the myth of Massada are that the Jewish rebels were heroic freedom fighters, that the siege lasted 3 years, and that at its end, the Jews all committed suicide to avoid slavery. Legend says the siege of Massada lasted for 3 years. How could the rebels, surrounded by desert and trapped on this parched mountaintop, have possibly survived for so long?
One of the key questions in the desert is how on earth can you get hold of water?
The rebels had chosen their position carefully. 80 years earlier, King Herod had constructed an amazingly efficient water supply system for Massada. Excavations have brought to light an ingenious network of aqueducts that feed into more than 24 water cisterns.
What Herod did was something that is very typical to people who live in the desert. You make use of the water that runs during the winter when you have flash floods. If you can control this source, you'll be able to provide yourself with an enormous amount of water.
It's estimated that the cisterns on top of Massada provided the rebels with an incredible 40,000 cubic meters of water. This cavernous water cistern is almost perfectly intact.
Water was channeled down here from the plateau itself. So basically every drop of water, whether it was running down the canyons or up here on top of the mountain, was collected.
Evidence that this water cistern was virtually brimming full can be seen by the high watermark on the plastered walls. Water supplies were vital for the rebels, but so was food. These marvelously preserved dates, pomegranates, olive stones, salt, and walnuts were found on top of Massada. It's mid-morning by the shores of the Dead Sea. At Massada, the temperature is already approaching 100 degrees. It's striking how arid, desolate, and treeless a landscape this is. Yet the myth of Massada suggests that a Roman army endured these conditions in a 3-year struggle with a force of Jewish rebels amply supplied with both food and water. Could a Roman army numbering perhaps 10,000 really have survived in the desert for all that time?
Massada is certainly not a hospitable place for any besieger. It's set on the edge of the Rift Valley, the Dead Sea in front of it, the Judean desert behind it. There was very little in the way of natural resources here.
From the Roman point of view, the logistics of the siege must have been absolutely horrendous. Here at the base of Massada, in the middle of the desert, you had to provide food and water for at least 8,000 men, probably more actually, plus animals, every day.
It has been calculated that the Roman force encamped at Massada would have needed 25,000 liters of water per day to survive in the desert. The nearest spring that could supply the Romans with this quantity of water was at En-Gedi. Jody Magnus has come here to investigate the physical effort involved in transporting water 2,000 years ago.
I believe that they would have been bringing in water on a daily basis from the springs at En-Gedi and Jericho to the north.
These jars are filled with water and then loaded onto the backs of a team of 4 donkeys. As the donkey train begins its journey, Magnus sets her pedometer running. She wants to find out how far it is to Massada on foot. Magnus is discovering that it's very slow going. After 6 hours in the searing heat, they approach Massada. She takes a reading from her pedometer. They've traveled 18.13 kilometers, more than 11 miles. And this is just one way, and only 4 donkey loads. The Romans would have needed 200 animals, making a round trip of nearly 23 miles every day just to keep supplied with water. But because Massada was so elevated, the Romans were forced to build their ramp at a steep angle. Was this the reason why the siege was supposed to have lasted 3 years? Structural engineer John Roberts has come to investigate.
I'm standing about halfway up the ramp up to the wall, and we must be somewhere on the edge of the ramp. These pieces of timber have been laid in with the stone and the rock pieces, and they're crisscrossed, so they're laid in one direction, and then they're laid across it, the next layer in the next direction, and then the next layer like that again.
These pieces of extraordinarily well-preserved timber were individually laid by Roman hands. They reveal the secret of the ingenious engineering design behind the ramp.
The crisscrossing of the timber forms little compartments where the stone pieces can go, and it makes the ramp edges able to be built at a much steeper angle, and so it saves material.
And the Romans had the perfect soldiers for using the slingshot.
According to Josephus, they had Arabian and Syrian slingers. They were specialists, presumably.
Muhammad Hamayes was taught to use the sling as a child. The deadliness and accuracy of this weapon is clear. At close range, it's lethal. So at Massada, a combination of artillery and slingshot enabled the Romans to bring their battering ram right up to the walls. Now it was just a matter of time. Night on Massada. Fires burn on the battlements. A grim choice faces the rebels.
Think about nearly 1,000 Jews. Let's say 400 would be fit to fight. The rest were just elderly men and women and children. Both sides knew that once the sun is up again, they're doomed.
The story goes that the rebels choose to take their own lives. Lots are drawn to decide upon the 10 men who will do the killing. Belongings are ceremonially burnt, and then the heroic last act of defiance, the mass suicide pact.